All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you remember last Friday, we were speaking about the book of Genesis chapter 4. I'm taking a little slower approach on the first few books, and then we're going to move on a little faster. Because the foundation of the Word of God, the Bible, is the book of Genesis. You cannot understand what God does later if we don't understand what God did earlier. So we need to truly understand the plans that God had for humanity and how those plans moved through history. So apparently there was a failure, man failed, and from God's perspective, nothing is a failure. Everything serves His purposes. Even the failure, ultimately God brought it back to His plan and purpose to redeem man and to bring man into a relationship that was not otherwise possible if man was created not to fail. If man was created not to fail, God would never have such a great and deep and intimate relationship with man, because man, after failing, realized how desperate he is to have God in his life. And therefore, the relationship is so strong. It is not out of compulsion, but is out of love that God is in relation with us. So with that in mind, we go to Genesis chapter 4. We did cover the first part where we talked about it last week, that there were two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain represented religion. Abel represented grace, and how Cain ended up murdering his brother, and Cain murdered Abel. And I ended with one statement. I said, religion always kills grace. Religion never is a friend of grace. Never ever think that religion and grace go together. Religion is always opposed to grace, hates grace, and will kill grace. And therefore, religion is grace killer. People who are religious are actually grace killers. Therefore, God is trying to show us two ways that humanity has: the way of religion, the way of grace. So we now continue with the balance of the verses in Genesis chapter 4, verse 9 to 12, and this is what we read. Then the Lord said to Cain, after he murders his brother, he says, "Where is Abel, your brother?" And he said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" He said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth." So that's the context of a conversation that God has with Cain after Cain murders his brother. And notice what happens. I'm not going to go through word by word commentary, but really, when you read this, you get four important points out of it. Maybe more. I saw four. You can maybe see even more than I did, but here's some suggestions. First of all, Cain's reaction, he has no remorse. When God comes and says, "What have you done?" he could have said, "You know what, I'm terribly sorry." He had no regrets. He didn't say, "Well, I made a mistake. I got angry and I lost my control." He's not apologizing. He could have said, "God, I'm sorry. I lost my temper. I lost my cool and I killed my brother. I know it was wrong. I regret it and I'm sorry. Please forgive me." No responsibility. He's not even taking responsibility. He's saying, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" He's completely brushing aside responsibility. And you know what? This is typically what and how we respond in our lives when something we do, we rarely are willing to take these four steps: no remorse, no regret, no apology, and no responsibility. And this is actually beginning of what is being woven into the human character. Our characters are becoming more arrogant and irresponsible and absolutely apathetic, and not coming into a situation where we can ask God for help. Well, when you become a Christian, what is it that you become Christian? That's exactly those 4 points. You have a regret and remorse, that you're sorry for the sins you've committed. You're asking God to forgive you. You're saying, "God, I'm sorry, I'm a sinner." And of course, you're taking responsibility because you are the one who committed those sins. We can't always blame Satan, by the way. Somebody asked me the question, why is it that every time we do something, we blame Satan? Well, Satan is the master cause of everything that we're experiencing. But we are personally responsible, because in the millennial kingdom, for 1,000 years, Satan will be bound. He won't be on earth, and yet man will still continue to sin. Maybe not as much, and yet man is by nature a sinner. He doesn't need Satan anymore. Satan is making it even worse by keep feeding that selfish character of man. So here we see that there is this situation with Cain's reaction. So God's reaction, obviously, is to make sure that the ground is not only cursed, which you read it in chapter 3, verse 17. The ground is cursed is the ground because of you. Because of Adam and Eve, he brought the ground under curse, which means this ground will no longer be a ground that God would approve anything coming out of it. Why? Because you see in chapter 4, Cain is trying to get out of this ground an offering that God rejects. It's a cursed ground. God cannot operate on a ground that is cursed. This is a principle. You know what? Probably next week or the week after, I'm going to give you a quiz of all the principles that are in the first 4 or 5 chapters. There's so many principles. I'm going to highlight it for you, and I'm going to see if you can remember what these principles are. But that's another principle right here. God cannot work on a ground that is under curse. Now, what is the definition of the word curse? Is not what we use in common English when you curse someone. A curse in biblical definition is anything that God withholds his blessing. If God says, I'm not going to bless this, that thing comes under curse. Withholding of blessing is curse. So God says, this ground is no longer under my approval. I cannot approve it. And that's not just on planet Earth. It's a spiritual principle. God cannot work on a ground that he cannot approve. He cannot bless it. And therefore, any ground other than the ground of Jesus Christ, which is what he says, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased, is under God's judgment. And therefore, God cannot work on those grounds. And look what happens in Genesis 4:11. Now you are also cursed from the ground. So first the ground is cursed. Now Cain is also cursed from the ground. A double curse on man and ground. In other words, neither man nor the ground are of God's approval. God cannot approve a man that has rebelled and began to act the rebellion, and so anything that comes out of the ground that man is standing on is no longer under God's approval. And that shows in the example of the low productivity and vagrant and a wanderer, which means you're aimless and you're purposeless. You have no purpose in your life. And trust me, we really have no purpose in our lives. I was just talking to my cousin outside about the fact that life is really aimless and purposeless. People come and young people die, old people die, people with self-respect, people that we love, they all end up dying. And, we heard so many lately. And it just makes you wonder, what is the purpose of life? If there is no higher purpose, which we see has absolutely no purpose. That's why in the book of Ecclesiastes, God says through the mouth of Solomon, vanity of vanities is chasing after the wind. Nothing is new under the sun. And basically, it declares that everything that comes from this ground and a man on that ground, both the man and the ground, are basically useless and purposeless. So then we continue with the verses. And verse 13 and 14, Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me from this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden, and I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me kills me. Well, I one time preached about this word face, that the salvation of man, the existence of man, the blessing of man, the life of man depends on whether man and God look at each other. When God turns his face or man turns his face, a catastrophe happens. And here he says, and from your face I will be hidden. Man realizes that God is not going to be looking at this kind of a man, this kind of a human, because this human is utterly corrupt and evil. And here are some points about these verses. Cain's anguish. No regrets. Again, he's not expressing any regrets. He's not returning to God. Says, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm going to come back. Please help me. He's beginning to bargain with God by saying, well, if you know what, if anyone finds me, is going to kill me, and I'm just going to be a wanderer, so make some arrangements that I don't get killed. And you know, in our lives, we try to make arrangements and bargain with God for something to improve what we know is already a pretty bad situation. And he accuses God of cruelty. Do you remember the verse? He says, you have made me a wanderer, and he's actually, he's accusing God that my punishment is too great to bear. Who's inflicting the punishment? You're too harsh on me. You're too strong. You are the one that is making this situation miserable. So in reality, he is accusing God of cruelty. God is cruel. God is not very fair. And of course, he says, anyone who finds me will kill me. So a lot of people ask me, well, did Cain and Abel have wives? Where did they find their wives or other people to find them and to kill them? The answer to that is in Genesis chapter 5, verse 3, that you would see later on. If you read it on your own, you would see that Adam and Eve had many sons and daughters. And because the life at that time was very long, it's possible that actually they could see their grandchildren and the great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren and the great-great-great-grandchildren. So you can do your math and find out in a very short period of time there were thousands of people all related to just the original family. And they heard about what this guy named Cain did to his brother. And since all of them were part of the same clan and same family, if they found Cain, they would have killed him. And obviously Cain is dead scared because he's going to get murdered by who? By his own family members. And, you know, again, the life was 900 and some years in most cases, and therefore these people would see many generations. Actually, at the time of the Noah's flood, which you read in chapter 6, just before the flood, the last of those ancient people died. That's Lamech. Lamech was the last one, not the bad Lamech, the good Lamech, which you read later on. He died at that time, just before the flood. So these guys had lived a long time, and they would see their ancestors a few generations back. So here we see the next verse. So the Lord said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord appointed a sign on Cain, for Cain, so that no one finding him would slay him. You know what? This is an interesting verse. I'm not going to go into the details of it. But here we see God's mercy. Here you see God's mercy. Cain is appealing that, you know what, I did this, but I am in a great danger. And God is showing mercy to him by saying, no one should touch Cain. I've already judged him. He's already given the correct punishment that he's going to be going away from me. And no one should take the law into their own hand. Vigilantism cannot be acceptable. You cannot do what he did. In some countries, you would see that if you kill someone, the family can come and kill you. They have the right. In their religion, they give the right to murder the murderer by the family members. Now, they become a little civilized and they have to consent to the execution of this person, and they have the right to cancel the execution. But that means you take the law into your own hand. You are the law. God does not want man to take the law and justice into their own hands without observing the principles of mercy. And you know what? There's a famous movie that was made in 1977, Midnight Express. It is a story of an American guy who gets arrested and imprisoned in Turkey At the time, there was quite a bit of a political tension there. And then he tells the judge, says, the quality of the justice of any society depends on the quality of its mercy. And that is a very important statement. Here you see God's justice is combined with elements of mercy. God spares Cain, so Cain is not murdered by his family members. Justice is ultimately God's business, not man's business. And what is this sign that he put on Cain's, some people say forehead, some people say on him? We don't know. And you know, when the Bible is quiet about something, we don't try to speculate. So we just put a question mark. It was whatever it was a visible sign that when people saw him, they knew that he had been judged by God. And when God looks at us, he sees all of us with the sign of judgment on us. And he removes that sign and he places the seal of the living God because of the Lord Jesus. We have been given a different sign. As you read in the book of Revelation, they had the name of their father on their foreheads. So we go to the next set of verses. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Well, there's some points here we want to talk about, and that is, Cain did not wander. He said, I'm a wanderer. He didn't really wander. He just walked out. He went across the river probably somewhere, and he wasn't a vagrant and a wanderer as he was making it such a big thing. I'm going to be a vagrant. I'm going to be a wanderer. Well, God was merciful to him, and he didn't do that. He went out from the presence of the Lord. He just left that presence. You know, we've heard about the presence. Here is the direct reference of walking away from the presence of God. When man walks away from the presence of God, that is the end of his existence. He's about to face a terrible reality that you either have the presence of God or another presence is waiting for you. So he went on the east. Now, why did I highlight that? Because in the Bible, directions sometimes have spiritual meanings. The pastor has talked about this in the past. God, in order to make sure that man understands where he's going, in the old times, they did not have compasses. They did not have, the understanding of everything environmental. So God had to teach them very simple lessons. He made a decision that anytime man moves east, he's going away from God. Anytime he moves west, he's getting closer to God. That's his arrangement. That was just a very simple way for God to convey a spiritual message. So you would notice that the first person who went east were Adam and Eve. They went east of the garden. The sun goes east of the garden. In chapter 11, you see that the people moved east to the land of Shinar, which was where Babylon was built. And all the time, people were moving east. And God said, I'm sorry, you're going in the wrong direction. You're moving away from my presence. You're moving away from my knowledge. And he encouraged them to go west. Who went west? Abraham. He was in Ur of Chaldees. He goes, go in the land of Canaan. That's west. So you would see repeatedly in many instances, God sends people going west. Not that there was anything great in west or something not so great in east, but it was only a lesson that they would learn that a movement represents our condition before God. If we're not right with him, he would show them in that example east. If we're right with God, he would move them west. As a matter of fact, the tabernacle and the temple, both their entrances were on the east side. The temple and the tabernacle entrances were on the east side. Why? Because people had to move west to get into the tabernacles. We always think, like most homes here are either south exposure or north exposure, but there it was east. People have to go east. Today in Jerusalem, there's the eastern gate that supposedly, according to the prophecy of Zechariah, Mount Olives is going to split and Christ is going to walk west, going through the east gate into the city of Jerusalem to declare his millennial kingdom. So that's why sometimes things in the Bible, we ask, why would the writer bother writing about east or west? And of course, in, again, biblical imagery, north is where God resides. But God is really not north. It's just giving you a visual orientation as to where you ought to be in your relationship with God. So that was just a little point about moving east. And you can go and look in the book of Genesis. So many times you would see east, and then God asking them to go west. So Cain had relations with his wife. In other translations, it says he knew his wife. And she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And he built a city, and he called the name of the city Enoch, after the name of his son. Now, by the way, this is not that Enoch that was later on raptured. This is another Enoch. This is not the very good one. This is coming from Cain. Anything that comes from Cain, to write off. No good, because their ancestor is already in rebellion. He's taken his family to east. He's taken his family away from God's presence. And he's no longer under God's jurisdiction and governance. He's completely separated himself from God. And his family and children are exactly like their father and their ancestor. Well, what do we see here? He built a city. Well, you would say, well, what's the big deal about building a city? There's a big meaning. Actually, it's another word in the scriptures about the word city. And God has so much emphasis on city. I think the pastor has talked about it several times in other conferences. And here is the thing, Cain's reaction. First child born to Cain, where? Away from the presence of God, because Cain is away from the presence of God. That's why our ancestor has moved away from the presence of God, and therefore all the children born to this human ancestry are away from the presence of God. Adam and Eve took us away, which is typified what Cain did. They all have moved away from the presence of God. That's why the Word of God says, all have sinned and have come short of the glory of God. You can say all have moved away from the presence of God. And if God's presence is not there, you don't know Him anymore. You have no relationship with Him anymore. There is nothing between you and God, and therefore whatever you do is going to be the result of being away from the presence of God. And the first thing that Cain does, because he is away from the presence of God, he built a city. He thinks that's the best solution and alternative to the presence of God. He says, well, I don't have God's presence. And God's presence means many things. Security, safety, provision, everything that God could have provided for me, I've lost those. So I better go and figure out a way to reconstruct, to revive, to put things together so I can survive. So his concept is build a city. What does a city represent? Here's what a city represents. You look at it from the top. The city gives the people identity. Every one of us are proud of our city. You know, I'm in Toronto, I'm in New York. That city gives you your identity. You identify yourself with the city you live in. That city gives you power and order. That city is a powerful city because it's got all the banks and it's got all the institutions. It gives you power. You're able to do certain things. Having a city gives you power. Compare a city with a village. A village has very little power. A city has tremendous power. A city gives you self-reliance because now we're going to take care of our own food, our own maintenance, our own water, our own electricity, everything. We are going to be self-reliant, self-sufficient. Isn't that what every city is striving to be? A completely self-contained, self-reliant, self-sufficient society. And of course, a collective mindset. The moment you build a city, everybody's going to come into a collective mindset. Now we've got to think together, think alike, act alike, rules and regulations, structure, limitations, everything is now governed by a collective mindset. And Satan is exactly what he wants us to do, to create a collective mindset where he can inject into that collective mindset the corruptive, corrosive thoughts that he has for humanity. And of course, last but not least, a city represents independence. We don't need anybody. We have our own city. And in the old times, cities had walls, which even made it more clear of their independence, self-reliance, collective mindset, and power and identity. You remember when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, the walls of the city came down, and the prophets and the people were crying because they had lost their identity. They had lost their sense of being under God's provision. Jerusalem was a very different city compared to every other city in the world at the time, because God resided in that city in the temple. Other cities had other temples with idols and with false gods. So Cain is the first builder of the first city, which typifies a complete cutting off the relationship with God, turning his face completely away from God, creating a completely independent way of living without having any necessity for God. There is no mention of God anymore. God has completely disappeared in the mind of Cain and his descendants. Now, to Enoch was born Irad, and Irad became the father of Mehujai, and Mehujai became the father of Methushael, and Methushael became the father of Lamech. This is the bad one, not the good Lamech. And Lamech took to himself 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, the name of the other one was Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play lyre and pipe. As for Zillah, he also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron, and their sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Genesis chapter 4, verse 18 to 22. So we're almost at the end of the slide presentation. Well, what happens out of this particular passage is, here is what happens. Corruption has set in completely. Why? Because Cain has moved away from the presence of God. Everything that is happening to him, to his family, to his aunt, everything that his descendants, they are all under a different mindset, a corruptive mindset. God's ordained order of relationship between one man and one woman is changed. We see for the first time bigamy or polygamy, you want to call it, having broken the relationship that a man and a woman need to have. Now he has 2 wives. He's purposely violating a rule that God had instituted in Genesis chapter 2. For this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother and will cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. He purposely violates that and gets 2 wives, as though he wants to tell God, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do what I want to do. And that is really a protest, a demonstration of rebellion in a very practical way. Lamech has 2 wives, rebellion has set in, the heart of man is further corrupted. So, you remember when I talked in the first sessions, I said when God created man, he gave man 3 principal functions that man could be the person that God had created him to be. He had given him the prophetic ability, in other words, he could hear God. He had given him the priestly function, which he could please God, and he had given him the kingly function, which was the ability to act for God. These were all in man, the abilities. All he had to do is to be empowered by life, and man would be in the same position as Christ, the man, which later on he had to be conformed to many thousands of years later. But why am I bringing this here? Because man lost these in the fall. The first thing that he lost the kingly ability. So corruption had set in when man lost the kingly function when he was expelled from the garden. God said, cannot rule anymore, cannot do anything to have dominion, out. Cain moves away from God and his children become more rebellious. The children of Cain begin the development of human industries. 3 industries that were the principal industries, and even today, I would say they're mostly the principal industries. The Jabal is horticulture, having cattle, sheep, and Jubal is communications and entertainment, lyre and pipes, music, entertainment, and Tubal-Cain is heavy industries and military, bronze and iron and things that are used in military industry. So these industries begin to now flourish in this city called Enoch. So Lamech says to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 70 sevenfolds. That's Genesis chapter 4, verse 23 and 24. This is actually a song, because if you read your Bibles, you would see that it is put in a certain quotation that appears to have been a song, that Lamech actually sang this. Now, I remember my grandmother used to sing all these folk songs, and these were probably folk songs that were remaining even at the time Moses writes Genesis. That song was still in memory of, in God's people's memory, that Lamech had sang this song. And there were two unnecessary murders that he mentions it. Some people say one murder, some people say two murders, because he says, I wounded a person and I killed a person. So maybe there were one person. I go back again to look at the verse, for I've killed a man for wounding me, a boy for striking me. Are they two people, one people? I just thought maybe there are two people that he's killed, a man and a boy. And both of them had done, pretty nasty thing by hitting Lamech. But what Lamech did was imbalancing justice. Corruption would affect your sense of justice. Inappropriate reaction. Now, nowadays, in the last few years, you've heard about this issue where the guy puts his hand in the pocket and the guy shoots him, says, I felt I was in danger. You go so far in doing something that maybe wasn't really appropriate. And there's so much debate in courts whether that was justified, the so-called stand your ground defense. Well, this is an example of an inappropriate and imbalanced action and justice. You know why? Because man has lost his relationship with God and therefore has taken justice into his own hand. And he can do whatever he wants to do as long as he thinks is right, he can do it. And in this case, Lamech actually murders two people or one person just because they hit him. And that's why the law of Moses forbade this kind of a behavior. If someone hits you and you kill him, you're responsible under the Mosaic law. There was punishment. Your life would be taken for doing something like that. That's why Moses brought the equality and balance in justice by saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand. Not that Moses was cruel and he wanted to see eyes poked out, but he was trying to show a balance in the administration of justice. If someone hits you, at most you have to hit back and that's it. Not kill the guy. Now, of course, in New Testament, we're under a greater law, which is the law of grace. Not that we have to abandon our rights. Some people ask me, well, is it true that Christians always have to turn the other cheek? I say, no. Christ never meant that, whenever they struck you, always turn the other cheek. As a matter of fact, the night that they arrested him, a soldier came and struck him in the face, and Jesus did not turn the face and say, please, one more. He didn't say that. He said, why are you hitting me? He didn't turn the face. He protested by questioning the soldier, why are you hitting me? If I've done nothing wrong, then why do you hit? So there are times you will turn the other cheek, and there are times you will not turn the other cheek. And that is when the Holy Spirit will give you wisdom to measure the circumstances. And of course, in these societies, God has given us social and all kinds of other laws that we're protected. And we have no problem by appealing to the law, as Paul appealed to Rome because they wanted to kill him. So, let's not go to one extreme that say a Christian is a doormat. No matter what happens, you got to say, oh, I'm sorry, you come and hit me and can abuse me. No such thing. But here you see inappropriate and imbalance in the administration of a reaction or justice. So, Adam had relations with his wife, and she gave birth to a son another time. So here we see Abel gone, and Cain and his clan are growing, corrupt, away from God's presence. So God needs a replacement. So he brings the third son who replaces the person, Abel, who died. So we read the verse, Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed to me an offspring or a seed in place of Abel. Seth means in place of. For Cain killed him. To Seth, to him also, a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. That's an interesting conclusion to chapter 4. And here's what we see in these verses. A new Abel. So God replaced Abel. Christ in his death stood where Abel stood and was killed by his brethren. There is a resemblance between Christ and Abel. As Abel was killed by his brother, Jesus of Nazareth was murdered by his brothers. And as he had brought an offering of blood, so did Jesus bring an offering of himself. And he was the true Abel who died and was killed by his brothers. But Christ in his resurrection became the Seth, a new life, and took the place by his father. So Seth is the Christ in resurrection. Abel is Christ in his death. And the fruit of Seth is Enosh. The word Enosh means man. The church is the man that God is pleased with because it comes out of Seth. Seth gave birth to Enosh. Enosh is the man that God is pleased, because now you're going to see two lines from this point on. You're going to see two lines from two families, the Cainite family and the Sethite families, and they are not very friendly to each other. Cainites are the ones who build city, and the Seth families go into the fields and are looking more into raising sheep and cows, because they understand that by raising the sheep and the animals, they are actually having all the time a supply of sacrifices to please the one God that only has one way of being pleased, and that is the way of the blood. So here we see religion and grace. The knowledge of God was completely lost to Cain and his descendants. Deviation and corruption was the hallmark of the Cainite dynasty. Sethites began to call upon the name of the Lord and to know him. This is the first time that after such a long time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. In other words, saying, what are we doing here? Why are we in this condition? Let's go back and call upon the name of Jehovah. And Sethites began to call upon the name of Jehovah. That's why you would see from this point on the descendant of Seth become the ones that Lamech would come from, who would be raptured. Noah would come, who would be going through the flood. Abraham, and then the rest of the Hebrew families, and then ultimately Israel, and goes all the way in Luke chapter 3 when you read chapter 3 or 4, the genealogy of Jesus Christ, who comes from the lineage of Seth and the rest of the people that are born from Seth, because they began to call upon the name of the Lord. And that's it for tonight. We're done with chapter 4, and we will continue later on with chapter 5, which is very brief. I'm not going to go into all the names and genealogies. We'll jump into chapter 6 the next session. Pastor.